My name is Emily Carter, and on Christmas Eve of 2023, 5 months pregnant, I sat at my family's dinner table expecting love, maybe even tears of joy. Instead, my father set down his silverware, looked at me with eyes colder than the winter outside, and said, "You'll get nothing from the will, and neither will your child." My mother lowered her gaze into her wineglass. My brother smirked, and in that silence I felt my heart break. Not for myself, but for the life inside me they had just rejected. But I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I placed a small red box in front of my father, smiled through the ache in my chest, and walked away knowing nothing would ever be the same. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The snow was falling in slow, lazy flakes, catching in the streetlights, as I pulled up in front of the Carter house on Christmas Eve 2023. The whole block shimmered with lights, but our family home stood out as it always had, towering and immaculate, trimmed with garlands, and glowing in a way that felt more like a showroom than a home. It wasn't decorated for joy, it was decorated to be seen. To remind the neighbors that the Carters still held their place at the top of Seattle's old real estate circle. I stood at the edge of the driveway, 5 months pregnant. My coat buttoned tight, but not tight enough to hide my belly. My hands clutched the small box wrapped in red paper with a satin ribbon, the gift I had spent weeks preparing. Daniel had wanted to come with me, but he wasn't invited. My mother's voice had been clear on the phone. Family only. The implication hung heavy. My husband of 2 years was not considered family. Inside warmth and the faint smell of cinnamon filled the air, but the cheer felt staged. My father, Richard Carter, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a man who had once commanded respect in every boardroom in Seattle. Now retired at 58, he still carried himself like he owned the city. My mother, Margaret, perched gracefully beside him, pearl earrings catching the light. Across the room, sprawled on the couch in an ugly Christmas sweater, my younger brother Michael thumbed through his phone, smirking at some joke that had nothing to do with me. "Emily," my mother said, rising only halfway from her chair. Her tone was smooth practiced. "You look, well." Her eyes flicked to my stomach, then away, as if acknowledging it too directly would make it real. "Thanks, Mom," I replied, forcing a smile. "Merry Christmas." I took my seat across from them, the box still in my lap, my pulse thudding in my ears. I had rehearsed how I would tell them, how I'd share the news with a smile, maybe even a little laugh. I imagined my father's stern face softening, my mother's eyes tearing up, Michael for once speechless. I pictured them asking about baby names, about due dates, about how I was feeling. The words were on the tip of my tongue when my father's voice cut clean through the room. "You'll get nothing from the will." The knife and fork in his hands clinked against the china as he set them down with precision. His eyes locked on mine, cold and unflinching, and for a moment the room seemed to stop breathing. I blinked. "What?" "You heard me," he said, his tone even final, like a gavel hitting wood. "There will be nothing for you. Not now, not ever. You've made your choices and you'll live with them." My mother tilted her head slightly, a faint nod of agreement. She didn't say the words herself, but her silence was confirmation enough. Michael finally looked up from his phone, a smirk curling his lips. "Guess that makes things easier," he muttered, eyes flicking back down, as though the family drama was just another form of entertainment. I felt my chest tighten, the sting of his words piercing deeper than I expected. The baby shifted inside me, a reminder that I wasn't standing here just for myself anymore. I sat frozen for 3 long seconds, staring at the people who had raised me, who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My father's face was a mask of authority, my mother's of passive complicity, my brother's of petty amusement. And then something inside me clicked. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't scream like they probably expected. Instead, I straightened in my chair, took a deep breath, and let a small, deliberate smile form on my lips. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out the carefully wrapped box and set it down in front of my father, sliding it across the polished wood with a steady hand. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said softly. His brow furrowed. My mother's eyes darted to the box, curious but wary. Michael leaned forward just slightly, phone still in hand. I leaned back, resting my palms on the curve of my belly. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. No one reached for the box. No one spoke. I let the smile linger on my face, calm and unshaken as the weight of the moment pressed down on all of us. The room with its perfect decorations and shining crystal felt colder than the snow outside, and still I didn't say another word. I just sat there watching them squirm in the silence I had left behind. It was the spring of 2020, and I was 26 years old, still finding my rhythm as a nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Seattle. The pandemic had thrown the hospital into chaos, and every night shift felt like stepping into a war zone of exhaustion, anxiety, and endless patient charts. I was used to scrubbing in with sore feet and a foggy brain, bracing myself for whatever might roll through the ER doors. That night, it was him. They wheeled Daniel Reyes in just past midnight. He wasn't in critical condition, just a motorcycle accident that had left him with road rash on his arms and a nasty bruise along his ribs. Still, blood trickled from his scraped knuckles, and the way he winced told me he was in pain. I put on my professional mask gloves, snapping as I moved toward the gurney. "Looks like the pavement won this round," I said gently, lifting his arm to clean the wound. His mouth curved into a grin, the kind of grin that was completely inappropriate in a hospital bed, but somehow disarming. "You should see the other guy. Asphalt's not looking so good." I bit back a laugh, trying to stay composed. Nights like these were never funny, but something about his calm, almost playful tone cracked through the exhaustion. He watched me as I cleaned his arm, his dark eyes warm and curious. "You're good at this," he said. "It's kind of my job," I replied, keeping my eyes on the gauze. "Yeah, but you look like you actually care. Most people just patch me up and move on. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I stayed quiet, focusing on wrapping the bandage." He didn't fill the silence with small talk. Instead, he just let it hang there like he was comfortable even in the stillness. It was strange how quickly I noticed the steadiness in him. He came back for follow-ups twice over the next couple of weeks, and each time I found myself looking forward to seeing his name on the chart. The first visit he teased me for remembering him. The second, he asked if I liked coffee. "Depends on who's buying," I said, surprising myself. "Then let me buy you one," he answered, quick and sure. That's how it started. A cup of coffee after my shift at a tiny cafe that smelled of cinnamon rolls and espresso. He sat across from me, telling stories about customers at the tattoo shop where he worked. He described designing pieces that meant something to people, art they carried forever. There was a spark in his eyes when he spoke about it, and I found myself leaning in, drawn to that kind of passion. Our coffee turned into dinners. Walks along Green Lake where we'd stop and watch the sunset bleed across the water. Nights spent in his apartment above the shop walls covered in sketches and inks, where he played music low and asked me about my dreams outside the hospital. I told him I didn't know anymore, that I'd spent so long trying to live up to someone else's standards, I wasn't sure what my own were. He listened, really listened. Daniel didn't come from money. His parents had worked hard their whole lives. His mother a retired elementary school teacher, his father a carpenter. They didn't own vacation homes or mingle at country clubs, but the way they loved each other and him was so unshakable it felt richer than anything I'd grown up with. One evening we sat on the stoop outside his shop, the smell of ink and disinfectant clinging faintly to his clothes. He leaned back, looking up at the stars. "I want to open my own studio," he said. "A place where people don't just come for a tattoo, but for something that means something. A place that feels like home." I looked at him, really looked, and felt something shift. He wasn't polished or packaged in the way my parents would approve of. But he was honest, and his vision was bigger than just himself. By the fall of that year, I knew I loved him. It wasn't some dramatic movie moment. It was the way he made spaghetti in a tiny kitchen, the way he laughed when he burned the garlic bread, the way he held me when the weight of the hospital threatened to crush me. It was ordinary and extraordinary at once. One crisp October night, the leaves outside my apartment painted the street in reds and golds. We had cooked dinner together, cheap wine and pasta with too much sauce. I was washing dishes when I turned and saw him standing there, oddly quiet. His hands fumbled in his pocket, and when he pulled them out, there was a small velvet box. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I can't imagine doing life without you. Will you marry me?" Inside the box wasn't a diamond from some catalog. It was a silver band, simple but stunning, etched with patterns he had designed himself. It wasn't about cost. It was about us. I covered my mouth, tears springing hot to my eyes. "Yes," I whispered, then louder. "Yes!" He slipped the ring onto my finger, and I threw my arms around him, laughing and crying at once. In that cramped apartment kitchen with pasta sauce still simmering on the stove, I felt more certain about my future than I ever had in my life. I didn't think about my parents in that moment. I didn't think about their expectations or their inevitable disappointment. All I thought about was him. This man who saw me, who loved me without conditions, who made me feel like I mattered. And for the first time in years, I felt free. When I called to share the news, I thought maybe there would be a pause, maybe even a reluctant blessing. Instead, there was a silence that felt like ice cracking beneath my feet. My father's voice came first. "You're destroying your future, Emily." His words were clipped cold, as if I'd just confessed to a crime instead of telling him I was engaged. I swallowed, gripping the phone tighter. "No, Dad. I'm building my future. With someone who loves me." There was a faint rustle on the line. Then my mother's voice slid in, smooth and saccharine, the kind of tone she used in front of guests at the country club. "Your father is right. You need to think about stability, about the family's reputation. People will talk." The anger bubbled before I could stop it. "I have a stable career. I pay my own bills. Daniel isn't some fling. He's my partner. He respects me." A sharp laugh cut through the line. "Michael, I hadn't even realized he was listening." "Partner. He's a broke tattoo guy. A wannabe artist who rides a motorcycle. You think that's husband material?" My chest burned. At least he works. At least he has dreams. What do you have, Michael? Another level on your video game. There was a beat of silence. Then my father's voice, louder, harder than before. "Enough. A Carter girl does not marry into that. You think you know better than us, but you're walking away from everything we've built. Don't come crying when it falls apart." The call ended with a click that felt final. I sat in my small apartment, the ring still warm on my finger, staring at the city lights outside the window. The tears came hot and fast, but beneath them was something stronger. Defiance. The wedding happened the following spring, 2021. It wasn't the grand ballroom event my parents had once hinted at when they thought I'd marry a lawyer or a banker. It was small, intimate, tucked into a garden on the edge of town. The air smelled of lilacs and barbecue smoke, laughter spilling from the Reyes family and our closest friends. Maria hugged me so tightly I thought she might never let go. "Mija, welcome home," she whispered in my ear. Carlos clapped Daniel on the back, pride shining in his eyes. Isabella. His younger sister danced barefoot on the lawn with her boyfriend, her laughter echoing like bells. It was everything my childhood had lacked. Messy, warm, real. But the empty seats on my side of the aisle were impossible to ignore. My parents hadn't sent a card, hadn't called, hadn't even pretended to acknowledge it. Michael had posted something cryptic online about losers celebrating mediocrity, and I'd seen it only because a friend forwarded the screenshot. Still, when Daniel slipped the ring onto my finger again in front of everyone we loved, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. In the weeks that followed, life seemed to settle into a fragile rhythm. Daniel poured his energy into his shop, sketching late into the night. I threw myself into 12-hour shifts at Mercy General. We were tired, yes, but happy. And yet, like a shadow, the Carter name lingered. One afternoon as I was leaving the hospital, a former classmate stopped me in the parking lot. "Hey, Em, is it true your dad cut you off?" He was talking about it at the club. The pit in my stomach dropped. What do you mean? He said, my daughter's made her choice and she's cut herself out of the Carter legacy. He didn't exactly whisper it. The words spread like wildfire. In Seattle's small circle of old money reputations were traded like currency, and my father had just spent mine like pocket change. At the grocery store, I overheard a woman mutter to her friend, "That's the Carter girl who married the tattoo artist." In the hospital cafeteria, a surgeon asked half-joking, "When's your biker husband coming to ink us up?" I tried to shake it off, but it gnawed at me. My father's voice echoed in my head every time someone looked twice at me. One night I broke down in our tiny kitchen, shoulders shaking as I tried to chop onions for dinner. Daniel slid the knife from my hand and wrapped me in his arms. "Hey, look at me," he said, tilting my chin. His eyes were steady, unwavering. "You are not their reputation. You are not their money. You're you." And that's who I fell in love with. I pressed my face into his chest, breathing in the scent of ink and soap. They've made me the black sheep, Daniel. I don't know if I can live with that. Then let them. Sheep or not, you're mine. His words were simple, but they steadied me in a way nothing else could. Still, the weight of that label clung to me. Black sheep, outcast, the one who had defied the Carter mold. At a charity gala later that year, my father raised his glass and in front of a table of his peers said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "My daughter decided she'd rather marry beneath her than uphold this family's legacy. She's out of the will and that's final." The laughter and whispers that followed rippled through the room like a wave. I wasn't even there, but word got back to me the next day. By then, it was official. My father hadn't just cut me out privately. He'd branded me publicly. I sat with Daniel that night, his hand warm over mine. The humiliation stung, but underneath it was resolve. I wasn't going back. I wasn't going to crawl to them for approval. If being a black sheep meant freedom from their cruel expectations, then I would wear it like armor. And as I looked at Daniel across our cluttered little table, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I had chosen love over legacy, and I would never regret it. After the wedding, Daniel and I moved into a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, a place with creaky floors and windows that whistled in the winter wind, but it was ours. For the first time in my life, I wasn't surrounded by perfection staged for appearances. The mismatched furniture, the stacks of medical journals on one side of the couch and sketchbooks on the other. It felt like home in a way the Carter estate never had. Daniel threw himself into building his dream. In early 2021, he rented a small storefront and hung a sign above the door that read Iron Ink Studio. The first few months were slow, but word spread quickly about his talent. People came not just for tattoos, but for the way he listened to their stories and turned them into art. By the end of that year, he had a waiting list, and in 2022, a local arts magazine featured his work. He came home one night waving the glossy page, grinning like a kid. "Look, Em," he said, laying the magazine in front of me while I was half asleep on the couch after a double shift. "That's my shop. That's us." I smiled, tracing the printed photo with my finger. "That's you," I corrected, though I felt the pride swell in my chest. While Daniel built his reputation, I kept grinding at Mercy General. Long nights, difficult patients, endless paperwork. But I loved my work. I cared for people when they were at their weakest, and sometimes that meant holding a hand when families couldn't be there. Dr. Walsh, my supervisor, noticed. One morning after a grueling shift, she stopped me in the hall. "You have a gift, Emily," she said. "Not everyone can stay this patient under pressure. You make people feel safe." Her words stayed with me. For once I felt like I was more than my last name. The Reyes family folded me into theirs seamlessly. Maria called me once a week to ask if I was eating enough, if Daniel was helping with the chores, if I needed anything. Carlos stopped by on weekends to help with repairs around the apartment, always leaving behind something he'd built. Shelves, a coffee table, little touches that made our space warmer. Isabella, with her youthful energy, dragged me out shopping when she thought I was working too much, insisting, "You need at least one dress that isn't scrubs." By the beginning of 2023, life felt steady in a way I hadn't expected. We weren't rich, not even close, but we were happy. Then, one chilly February morning, everything shifted. I stood in the bathroom staring down at the plastic stick in my hand. 2 pink lines. My breath caught, my knees went weak. I sank onto the edge of the tub, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the hum of the heater. For a long moment I couldn't move. When Daniel found me, I was still sitting there, clutching the test like it might disappear if I blinked. He knelt in front of me, his eyes darting from my face to my trembling hands. "Is that—" His voice broke off. I nodded, tears spilling down my cheeks. "We're going to have a baby." He let out a sound I'd never heard from him before, half laugh, half sob, and pulled me into his arms so tight it felt like he was holding the whole world together. His shoulders shook against mine, and when he finally leaned back, his eyes glistened. "Emily, we're going to be parents," he whispered. That night we lay in bed, my head on his chest, the test on the nightstand, like proof of a secret only we knew. He traced circles on my shoulder and murmured names he liked. Sophia, Grace, Mateo, Julian. We laughed about whose nose the baby would have, argued playfully about bedtime routines, and promised each other we'd be the kind of parents who loved without conditions. But even in that glow of happiness, a shadow crept in. I thought of my father's face, hard and unforgiving, of my mother's silence, of Michael's sneer. Would they soften when they learned they had a grandchild on the way? Or would they twist even this into something ugly? I tried to push the thought aside, to stay wrapped in the joy of Daniel's laughter, but it lodged deep in my chest. For all my defiance, a part of me still longed for acceptance, for the moment when my parents would look at me and finally see that I was enough. As I drifted off to sleep with Daniel's hand resting protectively over my stomach, I whispered to myself, "Maybe this will change everything." But even as the words left my lips, I wasn't sure if I believed them. When I finally worked up the courage to dial my mother's number, my hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice clipped but polite, the way she always sounded when she wasn't sure who might be listening in the background. "Margaret Carter," she said as though answering a business call. "Mom, it's me. I managed my throat dry." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Emily, how are you?" I hesitated, my other hand pressed against the small swell of my belly. "I want us to be together for Christmas. All of us. Like before." Silence stretched. I could picture her sitting in the immaculate living room with its cream-colored couches, glancing at my father, waiting for some signal. Finally, she said softly, "Your father. Daniel is not welcome here. This is family only." The words hit like a fist to the chest. Daniel, who had stood by me, who loved me without question, wasn't considered family. But I swallowed the protest rising in my throat. I was 5 months pregnant, my emotions a tangled knot, and some foolish part of me still believed the baby might be the bridge to heal everything. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll come." In the days that followed, I poured all my conflicted hope into a gift. I found a craftsman's shop tucked away in Pike Place Market and bought a hand-carved wooden box, polished until it gleamed. I wrapped it carefully in crimson paper tied with a satin ribbon. Inside, I placed the ultrasound photo, the tiny blurry outline of the child growing inside me, and a folded note written in my neatest handwriting. "This is the granddaughter you may never know." For weeks, I stared at that box on the shelf in our bedroom. Daniel noticed me watching it one night as he brushed his teeth. He spat into the sink, wiped his mouth, and asked, "Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted, "but I have to try." December 24th arrived gray and cold, the streets of Seattle buried under a thin crust of snow that turned the city quiet and solemn. I drove slowly, the windshield wipers brushing away flakes, the wrapped box buckled into the passenger seat like another passenger. My heart pounded the entire way up to the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Pulling into the driveway, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked pale, older than I remembered, but my hand resting on my stomach grounded me. I took a deep breath, lifted the box from the seat, and stepped out into the icy air. The Carter house loomed tall and immaculate. The roofline glittered with lights, each one perfectly spaced. A massive wreath with a gold bow hung on the door. I could almost hear my mother's voice directing the decorators, making sure every detail was flawless for the neighbors who would drive by. I rang the bell, and after a moment the door opened. Margaret stood there in a dark green dress, pearls at her throat. Her eyes flicked to the box in my hands, then down to the curve of my belly. She didn't smile. "Emily," she said, stepping aside. "Come in." Warmth rushed over me as I crossed the threshold, but it wasn't welcoming. The scent of pine and expensive candles clung to the air. My eyes traveled over the decorations. The towering tree trimmed with white lights and crystal ornaments presents, stacked neatly beneath garland, draped with mathematical precision. Everything screamed perfection, but it felt cold. My father sat at the dining table in a pressed shirt, scanning the financial section of the paper, as though it were any other night. Michael sprawled on the sofa, his sweater flashing reindeer lights, his feet up on the coffee table. Neither of them rose to greet me. "Hello, Dad. Hi, Michael," I said softly. Michael smirked without looking up from his phone. My father gave a grunt, not lifting his eyes from the page. I swallowed the lump in my throat and set the box carefully on the sideboard, beside a vase of perfect white roses. My free hand instinctively rubbed the curve of my belly as I followed my mother into the dining room. The table was set for 4 crystal-gleaming silver-polished wine already poured. I lowered myself into a chair, the baby pressing against my ribs, and folded my hands in my lap. For a moment, I almost convinced myself this could be normal, that we were just a family sitting down for Christmas dinner. But the silence told a different story. Margaret busied herself with the turkey, asking perfunctory questions about my health. "Are you eating enough?" "Getting sleep," without waiting for my answers. Richard turned the page of his paper with exaggerated calm, as if I were invisible. Michael chuckled at something on his phone, the sound grating in the quiet room. I sat there, the weight of the house pressing down on me, memories of childhood. Christmases flashing in my mind. My mother insisting on perfect dresses, my father passing judgment on every gift, Michael tearing into his presents, while I watched from the sidelines. Now, years later, nothing had changed. I pressed my hand firmer against my stomach, feeling the faintest flutter of movement inside. My daughter kicked a reminder that I wasn't just here as their daughter anymore. I was a mother now, and the child inside me deserved more than this emptiness. As I looked across the gleaming table at the people who had shaped me, who still saw me as less than, the realization sank deeper than ever I was no longer one of them. And yet here I was, hoping for something they had never been willing to give. The candles flickered against the crystal glasses, shadows stretching long across the table as I tried to steady my breath. My plate sat untouched, the turkey and potatoes going cold, my appetite long gone. I folded my napkin in my lap and forced myself to look at my father. "I have some news." I began, my voice shaking despite my best effort to sound calm. "Daniel and I are having a baby." For a moment there was nothing. Just the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint hiss of the fireplace. Then Richard set down his knife and fork with deliberate precision, the metal clinking against the china. His eyes locked on mine, hard and unblinking. "You will get nothing from the will," he said, each word clear and sharp. "And neither will that child." The words sliced through the air like glass. My mother's hand tightened around her wine glass, but she kept her gaze fixed on the tablecloth, her silence louder than any agreement. My brother leaned back in his chair, lips curling in amusement. "Pathetic," Michael muttered, shaking his head. My chest burned. My baby shifted inside me, and for one dizzying second I thought I might break. But I didn't. I drew in a slow breath, blinked back the sting in my eyes, and forced my lips into a faint smile. I reached down, lifted the wrapped box from the floor beside me, and slid it across the table until it stopped right in front of my father's plate. The red ribbon glowed in the candlelight, perfect against the polished wood. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said softly, pushing back my chair. I rose slowly, smoothing my dress over the curve of my stomach, and stood there for a beat, my heart hammering but my face serene. My father's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering across his features. He glanced at the box, then at me. "What is this?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "You'll see," I answered, simply, my tone as calm as I could make it. Margaret finally looked up, her painted lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Michael snorted under his breath, shaking his head again like I'd just pulled a childish stunt. Without another word, I turned and walked away from the table. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood as I crossed the dining room, the glow of the tree spilling into the hall. I felt the weight of 3 sets of eyes burning into my back, but I didn't look over my shoulder. In the hallway, the decorations glittered as if mocking me. Garland draped with flawless symmetry stockings, hung in perfect order. All the signs of a family that looked perfect from the outside but was rotting at its core. I reached for my coat, my fingers trembling only slightly as I slipped it on. Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair. "Emily." My mother's voice called, tentative, uncertain. I froze but didn't turn around. "You can't just walk away," she said, her tone soft, almost pleading. I closed my eyes, my hand resting on the doorknob. "Watch me," I whispered, though I knew she wouldn't hear. The last sound before I stepped out into the biting winter air was the faint rustle of wrapping paper, as my father dragged the box closer to him. Suspicion sharpening into something else. Snowflakes brushed against my cheeks as I pulled the door closed behind me. The night was quiet, still the cold air filling my lungs. My car waited in the driveway, the windshield dusted in white. As I reached for my keys, I paused. Through the window, I could see the glow of the dining room, my father's profile illuminated by candlelight as he studied the box. His face was a mask of control, but I knew, just as I knew the child inside me was real and strong, that his control was about to crack. I slid into the driver's seat, my breath fogging the glass, and gripped the steering wheel. My pulse pounded in my ears, but a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't begging for their approval. I wasn't waiting for them to change. The box would speak for me. I turned the ignition, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled away from the house that had never really been home. Behind me, the perfect lights twinkled against the snow, hiding the storm that was about to break inside. The night swallowed me whole as I drove through the quiet streets of Seattle, the snow still falling in thin sheets across my windshield. My hands clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white, but my heart was strangely calm. Behind me, the Carter house glowed like a beacon, but I knew chaos was unraveling inside. I didn't need to see it. I could feel it in my bones. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with Michael's name. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity or maybe habit made me swipe to answer. "What the hell did you do?" His voice cracked, ragged with panic. I kept my tone even. "I gave Dad a gift." "You think this is funny?" he shouted. "He's screaming like a maniac. Mom's freaking out. The neighbors called the cops. He's on the floor, Emily. They think he's having a heart attack." I tightened my grip on the wheel, the wipers thudding rhythmically. A part of me wanted to feel guilt, wanted to feel something other than this icy clarity. But all I felt was release. "You tell me," I said softly. "Was it worth disowning your own daughter over pride?" There was silence, broken only by the sound of him breathing heavily into the phone. "You've gone too far," Michael whispered finally. "He'll never forgive you?" "None of us will." I laughed once, bitter and short. He never forgave me for being myself. This just made it official. Michael cursed under his breath. In the background, I could hear Margaret's frantic voice, muffled cries, the shrill tone of paramedics barking orders. Then came the wail of sirens, piercing even through the phone. "They're taking him to Swedish hospital," Michael said quickly, his voice breaking. "Mom's going with him." "Emily, he kept saying your name. He said you'll pay for this." I pulled up to a red light, the glow reflecting off the snow. My reflection in the rearview mirror startled me. I expected to see a wreck of a woman, eyes red and swollen lips trembling. Instead, I saw myself steady, my face pale but composed. "Maybe I already have," I murmured more to myself than to him. What Michael demanded. Nothing I said. "Take care of him." I hung up before he could respond. The city stretched out before me, empty streets, lined with glowing storefronts and holiday lights. Families were gathered inside laughing over eggnog and tearing open presents while mine was imploding in a storm of rage and denial. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of Mercy General, the adrenaline had worn off. My body felt heavy, drained, every muscle aching. I parked, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes. The baby kicked, sharp and insistent, as if reminding me I wasn't alone. I placed both hands on my belly. "It's okay," I whispered. "We're okay. They can't touch us anymore." Minutes passed. Snow fell harder, covering the windshield in white. My phone buzzed again. This time a different number one I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call came, and another. Finally, I played the message. It was my mother's voice, thin and strained. "Emily, this has gone far enough. Your father, he collapsed. He's at the hospital now. You need to stop this nonsense and come here. We can talk like adults. Don't do something you'll regret." I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. Regret. I had spent my entire life drowning in their expectations, their disappointment, their cruel comparisons. Tonight, for once, I had acted on my own terms. The baby shifted again. I turned off the ignition and sat in the darkness, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. Somewhere downtown, sirens faded into the distance, carrying my father towards sterile white walls and machines that would measure his failing heart. I didn't move. I didn't call back. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Michael's voice came through the line, high-pitched and frantic, like he could barely breathe. "What the hell did you do? Emily, Dad's gone insane." He was screaming so loud the neighbors called the cops. "Mom's crying like she's at a funeral. They took him to Swedish. This is on you." I pressed the phone harder against my ear, staring out the windshield at the empty hospital parking lot. "No, Michael. This is on him. He made his choice. I just showed him the price." "You don't get it," he hissed. "You've ruined everything. Everyone's talking already. The Carters look like fools." "Maybe for the first time," I muttered. There was a sharp inhale, then the line went dead. By morning, the whispers had begun to spread. In Seattle's old money circles, news traveled faster than wildfire. At the country club, Richard Carter's name was no longer spoken with reverence, but with scandal. I heard through an old classmate that people were murmuring over cocktails, asking how a man so respected could lose his temper at his pregnant daughter on Christmas Eve. At church, where Margaret always sat in the second pew with perfect posture and a pearl rosary, the whispers were harsher. Families leaned together, muttering about hypocrisy, about how the Carters' perfect image was crumbling. Some said Richard had always been controlling others, swore Margaret had covered for him for years. I wanted to stay detached, but the truth found its way to me in cruel, jagged fragments. Sarah called me one afternoon, her voice hesitant. "Your mom rang me this morning." My stomach twisted. "What did she say?" "That you're unstable, that you're letting hormones cloud your judgment. She said you lashed out at Christmas, humiliated your father, and that she's worried about the baby." A laugh slipped out before I could stop it, sharp and bitter. Unstable. That's what she's calling it. She'd rather lie to everyone she knows than admit what really happened. "I don't believe her," Sarah added quickly. "But Em, you should know. She's telling anyone who'll listen." By the end of the week, the poison had seeped into my workplace. In the break room at Mercy, general conversations went quiet when I walked in. Two nurses I barely knew exchanged a glance and muttered something about stress making women lose it. I caught the word pregnancy, followed by psychotic break, and nearly dropped my coffee. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of eyes on me, judgment disguised as concern. I kept my head down, focused on my patients, but the gnawing dread never left. On Friday after my shift, I found an envelope in my mailbox at the nurses' station, my name typed neatly on the front. Inside was a notice report to Dr. Walsh's office, Monday morning 9 a.m. The air left my lungs. My vision swam. This was it. The thing I had feared more than my father's wrath, more than my mother's silence. My career. My one place of purpose and stability. I pressed the paper to my chest and closed my eyes. For a moment I imagined Richard's smug face, Margaret's delicate nod of agreement, Michael's laugh. They had found a way to follow me here into the one sanctuary I thought they couldn't touch. That night at home, I sat at the kitchen table, the letter spread out between Daniel and me. His hands were calloused from hours at the studio, but gentle as they covered mine. "They can't take this from you," he said firmly. "Not your job, not your future. They can smear you all they want, but truth has a way of cutting through." Tears blurred my vision. What if they succeed? What if Dr. Walsh believes them? He leaned closer, eyes steady. "Then you fight. The same way you fought every time they tried to break you. You're not alone anymore, Emily. You have me. You have this baby. And you're stronger than you think." The words warmed me, but the fear didn't vanish. It sat heavy in my chest as I lay in bed that night, one hand on my stomach, feeling the faint flutter of life inside me. My daughter shifted, reminding me that every battle I fought wasn't just mine anymore. On Monday morning, I would walk into that office and face whatever came next. But for now, in the stillness of our apartment with Daniel's arm draped protectively around me, I let myself rest, gathering strength for the storm. Dr. Walsh's office was warm and cluttered, the shelves stacked with binders and old mugs that looked like they hadn't moved in years. I sat across from her, my palms damp against my thighs, bracing myself for the worst. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Emily," she began, her tone even but kind. "I've heard the rumors. People are talking, but I want you to know I don't believe them." The air in my chest loosened, and before I could stop it, tears filled my eyes. "You are one of the calmest, most competent nurses I've worked with in 20 years, she continued. "Pregnancy hasn't changed that. If anything, you've become even steadier. Patients feel safe with you. I see it every day." I covered my face with my hands, embarrassed at how quickly the tears spilled out. "Thank you," I whispered. "You don't know what that means." "I think I do," she said gently. "And I want you to remember this. Your reputation here is built on years of hard work, not on gossip whispered by people who don't know you." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But my father wasn't finished. 2 days later, a thick envelope arrived at our apartment, delivered by certified mail. Daniel signed for it, his brows furrowed as he handed it to me. My name was typed across the front in bold black letters. I knew before I opened it that it wasn't good. I sat at the kitchen table, Daniel hovering over my shoulder, and pulled the papers out. The words blurred together at first, but one name stood out in sharp relief: Jonathan Price. My father had hired him, the most ruthless family attorney in Seattle. My hands shook as I read the first paragraph. "Dear Ms. Carter, our client, Richard Carter, intends to pursue legal action unless you agree to the following terms." The rest came in waves that made me feel like I was drowning. My father demanded that I sign away any claim to Carter Realty Group's remaining assets, to any portion of his estate, to everything. If I refused, he would sue for custody rights once my baby was born, on the grounds that I was emotionally unstable and unfit to parent. The room spun around me. "They can't do this," I whispered, my voice cracking. He can't take my baby. Daniel's hands landed firmly on my shoulders, steadying me. Hey, look at me. I lifted my eyes to his. We are not letting him win, he said. This is just another one of his power plays. It's intimidation, that's all. He doesn't have a leg to stand on. But Jonathan Price, I swallowed hard, bile rising in my throat. He's brutal. He wins cases no one else would touch. And my father, he'll pour every dime into this if it means crushing me. Daniel crouched in front of me, his hand resting protectively over my belly. Emily, you're a nurse with a spotless record. You've never even had so much as a parking ticket. You're healthy, responsible, and you have me, my family, your colleagues, all ready to vouch for you. He doesn't have evidence, just lies. Lies won't hold up in court. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let his certainty anchor me. But fear clawed at my insides, whispering, "What if?" over and over again. That night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep, I sat in the living room with the papers spread across my lap. The baby kicked faintly, reminding me she was there listening, waiting. My hands shook as I traced the lines of legal jargon words that threatened to rip her away from me before she even entered the world. I pressed my palm against my belly, tears streaming silently down my face. I won't let him take you, I whispered. I don't care what it costs me. He will not win this time. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the rustle of the papers as my fingers tightened around them. For the first time, it wasn't just my father's anger I was fighting. It was the law sharpened like a weapon turned against me. And though my fear was suffocating beneath it, burned something hotter, something fiercer. Rage. For all the years he had controlled me, silenced me, humiliated me, he had never reached for the one thing I knew I would die protecting. Until now, as the clock ticked past midnight, I sat there with my tears drying on my cheeks, one hand trembling over the mound of my stomach, and realized this battle wasn't just beginning. It was about to consume everything. The first time I saw my father's name in print after Christmas, it was on the bottom corner of page 6 in the Seattle Times. Just a tiny blurb, but enough to sting. Former real estate executive Richard Carter faces legal dispute with daughter over family inheritance. My stomach turned as I read it, my name not included, but implied the shame of our private war dragged into the public eye. By the end of the week, everyone seemed to know. At the country club, the whispers grew louder. A friend of Sarah's told me she overheard 2 men at the bar shaking their heads, muttering, "Carter's finally lost it. Suing your own daughter over an unborn grandchild. He's finished." Margaret tried to maintain appearances. She showed up to the winter charity gala in a floor-length gown, diamonds glittering at her ears, pretending nothing was wrong. But the crowd parted around her. Conversations died when she approached. The women she used to gossip with about vacation homes and private schools suddenly found the hors d'oeuvres table much more interesting. No one wanted to be seen clinking glasses with a woman whose husband had made his family scandal a headline. Even the church turned cold. At Sunday Mass, the priest avoided eye contact with her, skipping over the pew where she sat perfectly still, hands folded, lips tight. Parishioners whispered behind hymn books. Children who once ran up to hug Mrs. Carter after service now clung to their mother's skirts. The family that once commanded respect had become a spectacle. Richard tried to brush it off. He told anyone who would listen that he was standing on principle, protecting his estate from irresponsible hands. But his voice carried less weight than it once had. He no longer owned Carter Realty. He'd sold it in 2020, but the name still clung to him. Old associates began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends he'd played golf with for decades suddenly had full schedules. The Carter image built so carefully over generations was crumbling. I heard most of this secondhand, but Michael told me the rest. He called one night, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the cocky smirk I'd grown used to. "Dad's unraveling," he admitted. "He thinks suing you makes him look strong, but people think he's crazy." "You're just figuring that out." I snapped the bitterness spilling before I could catch it. He sighed. "That's not all. I found something. I waited, heart thudding. When Dad collapsed, Mom asked me to help organize some of his files. I went through the drawer in his study. There were bank statements transfers. He's been covering my expenses for years. Rent car payments, credit cards, all of it. I added it up. It's over $50,000. My grip on the phone tightened. You knew? No, Michael said quickly. I knew he gave me money here and there, but not like this. I didn't realize he was hiding it from everyone else, even from Mom. He's been feeding me while pretending you're the irresponsible one. Anger burned hot in my chest. Of course, my father had used Michael as a shield, financing his idleness while parading me as the family disgrace. So what happens now, I asked. Michael's voice cracked. It's over. He told me the money stops. No more checks. No more bailouts. I've got nothing, Emily. For a long time, I didn't answer. The silence stretched heavy with years of resentment and betrayal. Finally, I said, Then maybe it's time you stand on your own 2 feet. He didn't argue. For once, he didn't have a snide remark. Just a quiet, defeated, yeah. I guess it is. That night, lying awake with Daniel's hand resting on my stomach, I thought about how quickly the mighty Carter name was collapsing. The empire my father had built on appearances and intimidation was rotting from the inside, exposed to everyone who once praised it. And Michael, for the first time in his life, was cut off. The irony didn't escape me. My father had tried to destroy me, but the cracks were spreading in every direction. The house of cards he'd built was falling, and there was nothing left to hold it up. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the heater, feeling the baby shift inside me, and wondered how long it would be before the whole thing came crashing down completely. Michael's first attempt at real work came at a Toyota dealership on the south end of town. I heard about it through Sarah before I heard it from him. She said a friend had walked in to look at SUVs and spotted him in a wrinkled button-down, fumbling through paperwork, while the senior salesman laughed behind his back. I imagined my brother in that setting, awkward, defensive, his bravado stripped bare. For the first time in his life, no one was there to catch him when he stumbled. No monthly transfer from my father, no cushioned allowance. Just him and the reality he'd always mocked me for living. 2 weeks later, I heard the knock at my door. It was late afternoon rain streaking down the windows. I waddled to the entry hand, resting on my belly for balance. When I opened the door, Michael stood there, drenched and pale, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He started, his voice low. Can I come in? Daniel appeared behind me almost immediately, his eyes narrowing, his body tense. But I nodded and stepped aside. Michael lingered just inside the doorway, dripping water onto the mat. He glanced around at the cozy apartment. The baby crib Daniel had built in the corner, the stack of tiny onesies folded neatly on the couch. His eyes finally landed on me. I was wrong. He said the words tumbling out quickly, like he was afraid he might choke on them if he waited too long. About everything. About you. About Daniel. About what Dad said. God, I've been such an idiot. I crossed my arms, studying him. You don't get points for realizing that now. He swallowed hard. I'm not asking for points. I'm asking for a chance. I want to be better. I want to be the kind of uncle your daughter deserves. Just, please give me one chance. Daniel shifted beside me, his hand brushing my arm, a silent reminder to be cautious. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to sit in it. Finally, I said, If you want a place in this child's life, then hear me. Clearly, you will not breathe a word of her existence to Mom or Dad. Not a picture, not a story, nothing. If they so much as find out what brand of formula I buy, you're out. And don't think words will prove anything. Actions. Michael, that's all I'll accept. His eyes glistened, his voice cracking as he nodded. I understand. I swear I'll prove it. I didn't let myself soften, though part of me wanted to. I had been burned too many times to trust easily. But as I looked at him standing there, soaked through, stripped of all the arrogance that once defined him, I saw something I hadn't before: humility. For weeks after that, I watched him from a distance. He showed up at the dealership every morning, pressed shirts and polished shoes, even when he struggled to make a single sale. He didn't complain. He didn't call for handouts. Slowly, he began to build something for himself, shaky but real. Meanwhile, the Carter name continued to unravel. By early spring of 2024, word spread that Richard and Margaret's marriage was officially over. The announcement came not from them, but through the courthouse filings picked up by the local paper. Longtime Seattle couple, Richard and Margaret Carter file for divorce after 32 years of marriage. I read the headline twice, trying to absorb the strangeness of it. My parents had spent their lives performing a picture-perfect marriage. Now the mask had slipped completely. Richard sold the family estate, the house where every memory of my childhood still lingered like ghosts in the walls. He moved into a sterile downtown condo, stripped of the grandeur he once demanded. Margaret stayed behind just long enough to pack her designer clothes before moving into a rental near Lake Washington. She still wore her pearls, but the country club had stopped inviting her. The women she once lorded over now treated her like she was contagious. Michael told me he'd gone by the old house one last time before the sale. It looked empty, he said quietly, like a museum after everyone stopped visiting. The family that once prided itself on perfection had splintered the cracks, visible to everyone. My father alone in a high-rise, my mother a shadow of her former self, and my brother standing on my doorstep trying to stitch himself into the only version of family left. For the first time in years, I felt like the power dynamic had shifted. They no longer loomed over me like giants. They were just people, flawed, broken, and fading. And me, I was weeks away from becoming a mother, holding on to the fragile hope that I could build something better out of the ashes they left behind. June arrived heavy with summer rain, the kind that left the streets of Seattle glistening, as though the whole city had been scrubbed clean. I went into labor on a warm Saturday afternoon, the contractions starting slow, steady, then crashing over me in waves so fierce I could hardly breathe. Daniel never left my side. He held my hand until his knuckles turned white, whispered encouragement into my ear, wiped the sweat from my forehead when I thought I couldn't take one more minute of pain. Hours passed in a blur of monitors, nurses, and the sharp scent of antiseptic. And then she was here. Sophia Grace came into the world with a cry so strong it filled the room, 7 pounds of fierce life with dark hair plastered against her head and fists clenched tight. They placed her on my chest, and for a moment the world stopped. Daniel sobbed openly, kissing her tiny forehead again and again, his tears soaking my hospital gown. I stared at her, stunned, overwhelmed, and for the first time in my life I felt something close to freedom. All the battles, all the shouting, all the rejection melted away. Holding her, I knew I wasn't fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for her, and that knowledge made me feel invincible. The Reyes family arrived the next morning, arms full of flowers and balloons, eyes shining with pride. Maria cried harder than Daniel had, whispering prayers of thanks in Spanish as she kissed Sophia's cheeks. Carlos took one look at the baby and declared he was going to build her a cradle so sturdy it would last through generations. Isabella hovered over the bassinet, snapping pictures on her phone and cooing, already promising to teach Sophia how to dance when she turned 3. Even Michael came. He stood awkwardly in the doorway at first hands, shoved deep in his pockets. But when I beckoned him closer, he approached slowly. His eyes softened the moment he saw her. "She's perfect," he whispered, voice breaking. I handed Sophia into his arms, watching him tremble as he cradled her. For once his face wasn't twisted in mockery or arrogance. It was open, vulnerable, almost reverent. In that moment, I believed he might actually keep his promise to change. Meanwhile, miles away, my father sat alone in his downtown condo. The papers reported that his health had worsened, another heart episode keeping him confined indoors. No one visited. The men he used to golf with had long stopped calling. He had no one to rage at but himself. My mother tried to reach me once more, not directly, of course, but through her attorney. The letter was formal, carefully worded, requesting visitation rights to ensure the child's connection to her heritage. I read it once and handed it back to my lawyer. My daughter will not be handed to people who once disowned her before she even took her first breath, I said. The message was delivered and there was no reply. The contrast could not have been sharper. In my small apartment, laughter and love filled the air as we celebrated Sophia's first week of life with takeout pizza and homemade cake. At the Reyes table, where everyone crowded around, passing the baby from arm to arm, warmth radiated like sunlight. Across town, Richard and Margaret sat in separate homes, bitter and isolated, abandoned by the very community they had once ruled. Weeks later, when Sophia's tiny hand curled around my finger as we gathered with Daniel's family for dinner, I looked around the table and saw everything I had ever wanted. It wasn't money or legacy or country club reputations. It was belonging. I thought back to that Christmas night, to my father's voice ringing across the dining table like a death sentence. "You'll get nothing from the will." He had been right. I hadn't inherited his money, his company, or his approval, but I had something far greater. As Daniel lifted Sophia into his arms, as Maria laughed and Michael stacked plates in the sink, I realized the truth. I had been chasing my whole life. At Christmas dinner, Dad said I'd get nothing. He was right, because everything I need is already here. And if you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, I want you to know, you're not alone. Share your story, because sometimes the family we create for ourselves is the only inheritance that truly matters.